cloud. Beautiful. There we go. Well, without further ado, let me share about Dr. Jalal's background. He's a renowned neuroscientist, and the Telegraph has called him one of the world's leading experts on sleep paralysis. As a pioneer, he's designed one of the first ever treatments for sleep paralysis known as Meditation-Relaxation Therapy, MR therapy. For short, he was a researcher at Harvard and Cambridge, where his work mostly focused on neuropsychiatry. And with 45 academic papers to date, and Dr. Jalal is also a co-author on the book called Transdiagnostic Multiplex CBT for Muslim Cultural Groups and Treating Emotional Disorders, along with Devon Hinton. Some of you might be familiar with Dr. V.S. Ramachandran. I know there's certainly a few folks who have read the books as well. We've chatted about this before. So Dr. Jalal has also worked with V.S. Ramachandran, Richard McNally, and many other colleagues in proposing the use of the rubber hand illusion to treat OCD. And last but not least, his work has been featured in many, many countries, 30 plus countries, including bylines in the New York Times, Washington Post, and BBC News. And we're so thankful to have you here today, Dr. Jalal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me and for that generous introduction. Obviously, it's a gross exaggeration, but thank you. Thank you.
You're too kind. Before we get started, we have some really awesome questions that were submitted by attendees, but is there anything you would like to mention to start us off about perhaps how did you find the brain? How did you find sleep paralysis as your niche interest? It sounds like a really amazing field. And how has your work evolved over the years to where you are today?
It's a great question, Chinmay. I'm just going to put on the volume for the sound. It's a great question. So for me, I think it started out, first of all, with my own sleep paralysis, experiencing that as a young teenager in my bedroom in Copenhagen, sleeping and then realizing, my God, I'm paralyzed. I can't move. I can't speak. What's going on? And then suddenly have this feeling of a ghostly presence in my bedroom. And this presence is sort of coming near to me and pressing on my chest and strangling me. And a terrifying experience, obviously, as you can imagine. And then just thinking about that, what that might mean, like why you might see a ghost in your bedroom and things like that. And so that really intrigued me to want to study science and study neuroscience and the brain. So that was a huge factor, just my own exposure to neuroscience in real life in this way. What the brain can do and how it can trick us. And other than that, I would say good mentors, really inspiring mentors. You mentioned V.S. Ramachandran. He would be a great example of that. When I met him as an undergraduate student, he was just so inspiring, and just watching him lecture and talk about neuroscience and then joining his lab and just learning about how, science can be a great adventure instead of this boring thing where you just like 9-to-5 job where you study just one thing and it's boring. But instead it was just like you study the mysterious corners of the human brain and all that, it entails and stuff like that. So I think those were for me the things, like my own experiences with the human brain and what it's capable of and mentors. I would say those are the main things.
That's amazing. Definitely really love the note you ended on with mentorship really being a crucial path for ensuring our success. That's really amazing. And that sounds quite terrifying indeed. With sleep paralysis.
Have you had sleep paralysis before?
I have not personally, but I have friends who certainly have.
It's really creepy. I mean, think about it. There you're lying paralyzed completely, like it's shocking. You think, my God, what's going on? And then these hallucinations as well, it's just a really terrifying experience.
Absolutely.
And then the encounter with the ghost, it's just like, you feel like you're meeting this evil, like of epic proportions. Like it's not evil of this world. It's like much more evil than you can imagine. And it's just there in your room. Yeah, it's terrifying. So.
For sure. Just out of curiosity, I know there's a lot of horror movie representation of sleep paralysis and the paralysis demons. Do you have any thoughts on sort of that media representation of that? Any misconceptions that you've come across in your work?
It's a great question. I feel like a lot of the stuff in the movies is not too far from reality. In fact, like it's almost like movies are inspired by real ghost stories. And of course, many of these ghost stories emerge directly from things like sleep paralysis. So you'd be surprised of the overlap. I mean, there's this movie that I saw with my sister many years ago. I think it's called The Exorcist, with this little girl who's being pulled up and down and just down the stairs. And it's not too far from many of the sleep paralysis stories. We'll hear about people being paralyzed and these monsters with distorted voices and things like that. Yeah, you'd be surprised of the overlap between the movie world and sleep paralysis. And I think it's obviously these things, people will tell stories that will go into the movies, and also you can look at it another way, that movies itself, like movies and culture, will also inspire your imagination, and the kind of things that will be implanted in your mind, and then that can spill over into your dreams and sleep paralysis too. So there's definitely overlap.
That's really wonderful to hear about. I feel like oftentimes these days when we hear of science in the movies, it's sort of two completely detached realms. So it's very neat that we can sort of bridge it in that way.
Of course.
Yeah, and I've definitely had dreams of calculus appearing right before a math test. A very topical.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, it appears that a lot of people's fears and a lot of their sort of anxiety, issues will appear in dreams. So one of the most common dreams is being late for an exam. And think about this. I mean, you might be 40, 50, 60 years old, and you're still having this recurring dream of being late for an exam. Well, that has to do with the fact of all the anxiety that sort of was accumulating during the exam time, and that sort of remains in your brain circuitry. And then many years later, that it's just still there, and it's haunting you, in that
That's
way.
so interesting. It comes back at a later stage of life too. I'm not aware of that.
Yeah. So it's another example is your tooth falling out, right? So a lot of people have these dreams of teeth falling out, and probably it has to do with the fact that all of us had our teeth very loose at some point as kids, right? And
Right.
It's been very anxiety provoking. Obviously, we forget it later, but somewhere that remains in our brains, and then we keep having this recurring dream of teeth being loose and falling out and things. So
Right. Many shared experiences.
absolutely.
Yeah. Have you sort of seen overlaps into the trauma spaces, especially with people sort of reliving those traumatic memories and incidents in sleep, and the intersection of that with sleep paralysis?
Yeah. So sleep paralysis in itself can potentially be traumatizing. I mean, think about it. You're lying there in your bed, and a ghost is present, and this ghost is choking you, strangling you, and you're giving this ghost these cultural ideas. You're saying, well, this is a ghost. It's part of this narrative of these monsters in this culture. I mean, that amplifies the whole thing. So it's not merely a ghost. It's not merely just this one thing event. It's a whole sort of social cultural framework you build around it, and then it's no longer, and then it becomes like a possession too. If it reoccurs over and over, then it's like a possession in your mind, like I'm being possessed by this ghost, and then that could potentially trigger anxiety and depressive like symptoms. So those are some of the ideas we're making. And also there was this study by one of my colleagues, McNally, you mentioned Richard McNally, where he found that people that have encounters with space aliens, which are seemingly sleep paralysis because they're paralyzed and unable to move or speak. So it fits the sleep paralysis scenario. Well, these guys, when they hear encounters of these narratives on tape, of these sleep paralysis encounters, well, their physiological reactions, their heart beating, the sweating, will be as strong, as powerful as somebody who listens to their trauma stories, having been in war and having PTSD. So you can see potentially how traumatic this could be, especially if it keeps reoccurring. If you keep seeing ghosts over and over, well, that could potentially be a traumatic experience.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And going back to an earlier point, I know you mentioned experiencing these in childhood, early ages, and even folks having recurring sort of episodes onset of these later on in life as well. Is there sort of an age group or a population or a certain demographic that experiences sleep paralysis more frequently than others?
Yeah. So, well, think about this, Right. So sleep paralysis, just to define it, right? It's paralysis during the REM stage of sleep. So we cycle through different stages, and one of the stages of sleep, it's called REM sleep. You're completely paralyzed from head to toe. The brainstem, the pons and medulla has a system that paralyzes you completely during the REM stage. All right. So this is to protect you from acting out your dreams and hurting yourself. So you're unable to move or speak. Now, so sleep paralysis occurs because we mentally start to wake up. Our mental, capabilities, our sensorial systems become prematurely activated during REM. So you're awake on the one hand and paralyzed on the other in the REM stage. And so you're having this, this experience that you shouldn't have of these two worlds colliding, right? Okay, so this is sleep paralysis. Now, what can trigger sleep paralysis? It's unclear, but it seems to things like, anxiety, even things that, fracture REM sleep can lead you to have the coupling of REM and the wakefulness part of the brain, right? So people with anxiety, people with stress, people who drink a lot of alcohol, drugs, things like that can potentially tilt you into that state of being prematurely, wakeful. So if you have what's called nocturnal arousal, which is your emotional part of your brain being hyperactive during the night, well, then that could push you into having sleep paralysis more frequently in that way. I would say that. And then going back to the whole cultural link, right? So if you live in a culture where it is a ghost, where it is a demon with a certain cultural name, then you're more likely to also have anxiety being triggered and then having more sleep paralysis. In fact, we compared sleep paralysis in Egypt and Denmark, and sleep paralysis was 3 times more common in the Egyptian population compared to Denmark. And we believe that has to do with the cultural ideas of the evil genies that attacks you, choke you, and things like that, which is the cultural idea in Egypt, in the Egyptian context. So there's a long answer to your question.
It's very fascinating. And in those cases, let's say where perhaps someone who's experienced a sleep paralysis episode, if their immediate reaction is not to just sort of jump to a Western medical solution, how are sort of ways that people might cope with that? Have you seen any sort of cultural communities that focus on alternative forms of healing or seeking out certain people as a way to treatment or anything in that avenue?
Chinmay, you have read my papers. I can. So you're asking these questions. Yeah, so in certain cultures and cultural contexts, people will go to the cultural, because think about it. You're seeing a ghost, for God's sake. There's a ghost in your bed and you're hallucinating, and you have no idea you're hallucinating because you and I and most people don't hallucinate during the day and see ghosts and things like that. So it is like, obviously going to a doctor does not make sense for a lot of people. Including myself, when I had sleep paralysis, my thought was not to go to a doctor because I'm seemingly fine, during my normal day, I'm functioning and things like that. And, going to my friends, I probably lose credibility by saying that I saw a ghost. Do I go to my parents? It's just kind of weird. So it kind of does make sense to go to somebody who has a spiritual, idea for that. But, the thing is, so that is true. So people will go to, cultural healers and things like that for sure. And sometimes these will propose ideas that can actually make it better, because if you feel more relaxed and comfortable and things like that, well, that's a good thing. In fact, my therapy, which I'm sure we'll get into later, that is derived from some of these ideas of soothing yourself, during the experience, and that way calming yourself down and being able to sort of get through it in that way.
It's really great to hear. Always really great to hear those cross-cultural perspectives.
Sure.
You had mentioned that in Egypt, it's more common to perhaps experience and identify as well. What would you say is the overall frequency among the population? Because I think this is something that's definitely in the sort of general thinking, if that's a good way to, the general consciousness. People know about sleep paralysis, but how many people are experiencing this on a regular basis?
It's a good question. So it's about 20% of the population have had sleep paralysis at least once. But of course, there's people with like recurrent isolated sleep paralysis where it occurs like frequently and it becomes a pathology. It becomes a parasomnia. So it's like a sleep disorder. But yeah, 20% have had it at least once, but it does, of course, vary in the population, as we mentioned. And Egyptians would be an example of people who have it a lot. Anxiety prone people have it a lot. In fact, college students are one of the most afflicted population because of their sleeping schedules and, waking up in the middle of the night, stress, exams. So yeah, you guys are, potential candidates for sleep paralysis. It's very common in college students. So that would be another example.
Well, we ought to keep an eye out. This is the prime population right here attending this Zoom. So that's really amazing. You had also mentioned links with anxiety or other conditions as well. Yep. Are there any direct correlations that you see most frequently in terms of being diagnosed with mental health illnesses or conditions that can sort of set the stage for sleep paralysis?
Yeah, so the research suggests that people with the typical type of anxiety disorders tend to be more likely to have it. So people with anxiety, just generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD and panic disorder. And so the typical disorders where sleep is fragmented. And imagine like PTSD, it's even more. I mean, it's just PTSD is known for fractured sleep with reoccurring nightmares as well. So yeah, so those would be the main ones.
Got you. And in terms of the therapeutic responses to these, I'm sure there's a wide spectrum, and you've definitely spoken a lot before about the ones that you've specifically developed as well. Would you be able to share a little bit more about the range that is out there, set the scene for us?
Yeah, so in terms of therapies for sleep paralysis, SSRIs have typically been used. So these are serotonin reuptake inhibitors that can and sort of works on the serotonin system. And these tends to not only boost serotonin, but also can improve sleep in that way. And it does make sense if your mood and overall well-being is better, you sleep better. That's something. And also, of course, serotonin plays a huge role in sleep and obviously in REM sleep too. Serotonin producing neurons during REM sleep are not firing. So that has been used as an approach. Other approaches, I guess, have been sort of things like sleep hygiene, CBT-like techniques, meaning sort of saying to people, oh, don't be scared. This is, something from the brain is causing this. It's common around the world. And so sort of these kinds of things to take the punch out of the experience and make it more, acceptable and less, mysterious and ghostly and all that. So those techniques have been used. And so those, I'd say the main ones. So CBT and drugs, mainly drugs working on SSRIs or even noradrenaline. Those have mainly been used.
That's really wonderful to hear. Some pharmacology implications there if anyone is interested in the free pharmacy route, perhaps something to explore there as well. Would you be able to also share more about the meditative therapies? Because I think oftentimes meditation is something we just think of as the daily 5 minutes on the phone app, but in this case, it seems like a very impactful way to deal with this condition as well.
Yeah, you're right. So it potentially could be, and it seems to be helpful. So it's based on 4 steps. So the person would be lying there, sleeping, and then as sleep paralysis occurs, the person would sort of do a few steps first to take the panic out of the experience. So things like cognitive reappraisal, just meaning fancy name for just like reappraising the whole thing, saying, look, this is not a ghost, this is not terrifying, all that stuff. And then what is called emotional and psychological distancing. And, in other words, because it's not terrifying, because it's not a ghost, because of this cognitive correction you've given it, reinterpretation, then there's no real reason for me to be scared, right? So you do these kinds of, and these are standard CBT techniques, all right? And then the third step is then you focus all your attention on something extremely positive. right? So this is where the cultural layer comes in, because then if you have, could be a cultural thing, it could be the face of your mother, it could be a prayer, whatever but whatever is really salient, powerful, and meaningful to you, you focus in on that and meditate on that intensely. So focus meditation. And the idea is that attention is a scarce commodity. There's not a lot of attention going around in your brain. So you want to recruit all the attention circuits in your brain and use it towards this positive object that you're engaging with. So you have this emotion centeredness. You focused, hyper focused, in fact, on this. And so for this reason, your attention will not go towards demons, ghosts, and things like that. That will then color the content of the hallucinations. So yeah, that's the third step. And then finally, you would just relax your muscles, avoid flexing your muscles and trying to move and all that. Just kind of letting it pass. The reason is, well, I can tell you the reason, but it's going to get a little bit complicated. But the reason is that if you try to move during sleep paralysis, we've suggested, and probably others too, that leads to sort of dysynchrony in the sense of how your body image is created. And what I mean is, think about it, you're paralyzed, unable to move or speak, right? So you can't move, and you're sending commands, your motor commands saying move, 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 but there's no feedback coming back to your brain, allowing you to actually move. And so this discrepancy, this incongruent situation could lead to spasm. It could lead to a sense of like pain in limbs and things like that, which could be interpreted as ghost, and it's uncomfortable and all that. So yeah, we say avoid that. Even breathing, even if you try to control your breath, because during REM sleep, your breathing is actually automatic. So you go like this, your breathing is automatic. And so if you try to control that again, then that will feel like a pressure on the chest. And guess what your brain says if there's a pressure on your chest during this episode? You're saying, my God, there's this ghost pressing on me. It's on my chest, it's on my throat. You build a narrative around it. So yeah, I think trying to avoid moving could be useful. So these are the 4 steps. You would apply them during sleep paralysis, and it seems could potentially do some good.
That's really awesome. It's really, really fascinating to hear the breakdown. Gosh, I know we've been on a very rapid pace of questions, but audience members, folks here today, if you have any questions for Dr. Jalal, please type them into the chat. We can also spend some time chatting about careers, kind of day-to-day, also outside of research avenues as well. So keep those questions coming. We always love to see questions. Dr. Jalal, just out of personal curiosity, I know you have lectured at the undergrad level at different universities before. You're doing all this amazing work. What does a day-to-day life look for you usually?
Oh, that's a great question. It's not
I'm sure it varies, but maybe a typical day.
Yeah, my day-to-day life. Wow, that's a great question, because it's been sort of lately with the whole COVID and all that. It's been a really weird thing. I mean, think about it. You mostly have been in your room and you're talking to people through a screen. It's almost like you're living a different world. I mean, literally like the Matrix, or some kind of surreal world. And yeah, you're communicating with people on a screen, and then you go out and then you face the real world, and people are flesh and blood. It's just this weird, strange mix, But I think going out to the real world again after COVID has been really nice. It's just, you kind of miss the human interaction, whether it's on the bus, just seeing a face, or seeing a child, or seeing a tree, like being out. Don't want to exaggerate here, but it does feel good to be outside again. But my working life is, a combination of just like research papers, supervising students, and occasionally lecturing, and various things like that I do. And yeah, it just keeps me very busy, and traveling sometimes for research, and but I'd say the best answer is that it varies a lot, but I'm trying to juggle a bunch of things and stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah, it's really great to sort of have that variety. It seems like it makes the day-to-day more exciting.
It does. To have a little bit of variety is very good. Yeah.
Yeah. Was teaching undergrads and students in general something that how did that sort of come into you? Because I know some people come in thinking, oh, I really do not feel like I'm meant to be a lecturer. And then some people just know it from day one. Sort of teaching mentorship process. Would love to learn more.
No, it's a great question, because I mean, traditionally this idea, in science, and a lot of scientists, especially like me, some of the mentors that I had, were very busy with science and just prioritizing science instead of like teaching. Teaching was just like a thing that the institution would force you to do almost, and you just go do it. No, but I really do like teaching. For me, it's been one of those things that I really like. It's just the interaction with humans, seeing them, being excited by the science, and then it makes me excited in turn. Like, oh wow, this, so it's like it's that's something that I really enjoy. Maybe it's just because I am by nature a very social creature in many ways. Maybe it's that, I don't know. But I love teaching. I love explaining science, and so I think it's a personality thing, like Ramachandran, you mentioned Rama, right? He was also, he's a great lecturer. I mean, he's great at lecturing. And, seeing him, just like the way he would lecture and things like that was just very inspiring. And I thought, wow, it's cool to, lecture and things like that. It could be really fun. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a personality thing though. I think it could be.
Yeah, it's always really, I think even the students, and it's really awesome to have professors and instructors who really want to be there. I'm sure like for high school students or college students here, you can always tell when a professor is just really enthusiastic about being in the classroom,
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
in the post-COVID world. It's been a interesting dynamic.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Um, you're a prolific science communicator, to put it at the very least. How
Oh,
is your
appreciate that.
how has your experience been with, I know you have spoken to international audiences. We have an international audience here today, small knit one, with podcasts and interviews and a whole range of things. How did you get started with that avenue? Any positive experiences you'd like to share with us, or advice for students who are interested in that career path as well?
Science communication is a great question. I'd say, if you study interesting things, that really is, that you really find interesting, like go into science and study whatever really, it makes you excited. And when you do that, automatically when you go teach it and convey it to others, people will feel that passion. I mean, so I think that is the key. Really, it starts there with the science, and again, the personality thing. You should be having that. Yeah, I think going for interesting things that makes you passionate, and then conveying that passion that will definitely show. So that would be a thing. And how else to get started? I think nowadays, for me, it was maybe different because of the stuff that I studied. People always wanted to hear more about it, like, sleep paralysis, ghosts. What are you talking about? Like, what is going on? What do you mean, dreams and all? And so, but yeah, I think those are the main things. But nowadays, there's so much possibility for communication of science. So we need we need a lot of people to go into this field, and the way to do that is just by reading. Reading widely. Also, it's also great, because then you can also sort of you have more interesting perspectives. That's what Ramachandran always told me. Read widely, everything under the sun. Read. That would be helpful to you. So that goes into science communication. Having, yeah, I think those are the main key things, I think.
I really appreciate that. I think a number of students in our community are now looking into science communication routes, since it's something that you can truly see the impact of, investing time and energy and passion into. Um, yeah, I would also love to know more about career paths, traditional academia routes or non-traditional routes.
Yep.
And the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis, are most of them scientists with an MD or a PhD? Any sort of unique stakeholder backgrounds that you've seen, patients coming in? Sort of any of that ecosystem would also be wonderful to learn more about.
Yeah. So I just need a last part of the question. What did you mean? Can you just repeat it? So
I mean, like on it, let's say if you're, I'm sure, interacting with patients, interacting with research participants, one of our focuses is on understanding like traditional and non-traditional paths in science. So
yeah,
if there's folks you've worked with that don't necessarily have the traditional PhD or the MD, and how they contribute to the projects you're working on as well.
it's a very good question. So in terms of the traditional and non-traditional routes, I think uh, it depends on really what you want to do. I mean, the traditional route of just, doing science and then becoming a professor and then going down that route is interesting and it's great. I think these days you can combine that also with non-traditional stuff if you wanted to. So it's not that rigid in that way. You're seeing more and more of science communication and other things too. Um, but in terms of my day-to-day and things, um, I want to give you a good answer, but I'm not sure how I understand the question 100%. So what is the question exactly, like on the last part?
Sure. As in, are your collaborators mostly folks who have an MD degree and a PhD degree?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, not necessarily. So, I mean, I work with a lot of students who work with me that, I have BAs, master's students, sometimes PhDs, MDs and things like that. But so those are the kinds of things, but you don't have to. I mean, I always said you don't have to have a degree to do science. I mean, degrees are good for the institution, but for science it doesn't matter. It's per se, if you have the expertise and your interest and passion and all that, then that's fine. But yeah, you don't need to. I think you don't have to be that rigid about these things, I think. And I would never sort of make that a huge thing, but I think the institutions can be, I mean, there's a structure in the institutions. And so if any of your, the students in this group, for example, want to do science, it might be a good idea to get either the MD or the PhD. I think the MD would be if you really want to see patients on a sort of consistent basis and things like that. So I'm not an MD, I'm a PhD. So for me, I don't treat patients. I mean, I see clinical patients for research done, but I didn't have a PhD for that. I mean, I did that when I was a BA. I mean, everyone can do that, just research, and then obviously you would do more of that. But yeah, I think especially the MD. I mean, you don't have if you really want to be a clinician and you want to do that, then the MD is good. If you want to do clinical training, then obviously there's that part as well. You can do like clinical training and all that. Does make sense?
yes, that is perfect. I'm sorry for the confusing route to
No,
getting
no.
there. And that makes sense completely with the clinical and non-clinical routes as well.
Very good.
And thinking about the world outside of universities and the world outside of traditional academia as well.
Yeah.
Have you crossed paths with any companies, startups, innovators who are working on technologies related to sleep paralysis or things that are outside the university in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I do sometimes interact with people, hear about like different ventures, not sleep paralysis per se. Well, sleep paralysis too. I've heard of people that I've sort of talked to, but I've never had a company say like we work on sleep paralysis per se. But other things definitely neuroscience things, companies that work on the brain in various ways. And yeah, I mean, it's a great question because if you take the traditional route and become a scientist, if you wanted to do that, then you can always consult, be a consultant, speak to companies, give them your insights and things of that nature. So yeah, definitely, there's a lot of these things, and these people, meaning people in industry, are really eager to interact with people in academia or within science background because it's where they're lacking, maybe, right? They're business people, many of them, and so they would love to know more of the academic route. So yeah, it's a great intersection, I think. Really interesting.
Absolutely, a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And let's say in your broader work relevant to psychiatry and the brain, another topic of interest to our students is always the ethical questions that come up.
Yeah.
Have there been any sort of pressing ethical topics, issues that I've raised for you over the years? And how do you, as a neuroscientist in the midst of that, work through that?
Ethical question. That's a great question. That's a great question. Ethical. I want to think of something. Ethical issues. I can't think of any sort of ethical dilemmas right now. Obviously, when you see patients with various, like in pain and things like that, that's can always be something, but it's not really an ethical dilemma. I can't think of anything right now per se of other than, I mean, there's this, like, of course, like you have a patient, you cause them some distress by doing some intervention, but I mean, I think we've been very good at sort of reducing that, so we didn't cause too much, distress to patients, but that's always the thing, of course. I mean, if you think about it, somebody with OCD, for example, like OCD is a terrible disorder with people, they can't wash hands. I mean, if they touch somebody with, just shake hands, they will get very, very anxious and distressed. And sometimes you bring them in to the clinic or the research center and ask them maybe to do something that they find extremely uncomfortable. Well, that can be a bit, to watch, but, we do it for the greater good, of course. So, but yeah, no, I can't think of any ethical dilemmas as of now. Do you have any examples of yourself or anything you've encountered of ethical issues or in science?
Personally, I think I've recently been hearing a lot about sort of neurotech companies and how students might unfairly use them for, I don't know, an advantage on an exam, let's say.
Yeah.
Or it's very niche to neurotechnology, I'd say. But yeah, I think the idea of like patients making sure that they're completely consenting to these different research studies.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. No, I haven't personally encountered anything of that nature. I mean, of course, animal research is another one. Like how far do you go with like animal research, like causing pain to animals and things like that? But I'm not an animal researcher, so it's not been in my domain. But yeah, I mean, these are all ethical issues that we are wrestling with as in this field.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for your insight. We have received a private message with this question, but we have students, very young students on the call as well. This particular student is a freshman in high school, a ninth grader,
Wow.
who feels very passionate about neuroscience.
Very
And
good.
they're wondering if you have any recommendations for sort of the early activities to get involved in the field, courses, clubs, organizations, internships that you found really helpful in terms of early exploring.
Yeah, it's weird. I think where I was like coming out of high school to where I am today, like that path was unbelievably curvy and like there was not a clear direction ever. I mean, I went here and then suddenly I went here and then I went back. I mean, everything has been unbelievably crazy. So thinking of this from A to B to C, it's not how it works. I think whatever you do it very well. Be very open-minded, study a lot of things, do a lot of things. In terms of like specific clubs and things, yeah, join the clubs that you like. But also, I think there's a lot of focus on like, if you do like, have all these, clubs on your CV, it's a good thing and all that. I guess it could be, but I would rather like focus on a scientific topic early on, maybe study that, learn about that early so you get an advantage of knowing something very well. So I think reading is another thing, like that's another thing that I would like focus on. If you have knowledge and just study and read books, I think that can be extremely helpful to you. And the reason is, I mean, I know it sounds a bit fluffy and out there. Yeah, it's good to have knowledge, but I need the knowledge for my exam, right? And then that's it. But the thing is, when you have that vast knowledge, right, you read a lot, and I'd love to have more knowledge. So I'm not saying myself, but I'm saying if you do, and you have that knowledge and you just study a lot and read a lot, then ultimately you will meet certain people in your career at certain points. Like me, I met Ramachandran, or I met somebody else very early on, right? And then if you have a certain uniqueness about the way that, your background, your story, and the ideas that you have, well, people will sense that, and they will pick it up and then be able to, maybe they will, because of that, your career could change. So it's not always these very specific things like, oh, I get a 4.0, or I get a, I joined this neuroscience club and I become the president. And, all these things are good and look good on the CV, but I think having like real knowledge of various things, I think it's a very powerful thing. And it's so underneath the surface, but then one day it can just like make the big difference for you. So, and then, yeah, I think those would be.
It's very well said. Appreciate that.
Thank you. And I should read more. I'm not saying that I read a lot, but it'd be good to read.
Absolutely. There's always these wonderful, wonderful books being published. It's many to keep up with.
Yeah.
Parneet, I see you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, so I had a question for Dr. Jalal. I wanted to ask, you work on like sleep paralysis, right? And psychology can be a very, I would say, a difficult subject in a way that there's so much subjectivity, and that can be a challenge when you have to have generalizable research or whatever. So when you're studying something like sleep paralysis, where you're talking about hallucinations and dreams, and obviously there would be some challenges that you might have faced, like especially doing cross-cultural researches or yeah, so is there anything particularly that you observed, like a challenge, and how did you overcome that?
It's a great question, Parneet. Thank you for asking that. Challenges. I mean, there's been a lot. I mean, the thing is about every science project that I've ever done, there's always challenges. I mean, this could be the smallest of challenges that will delay things. I mean, I've had studies that we started applying for like the ethical approval, and then 7-8 years later, the project was done. I mean, even a Hollywood movie takes like 2 years max. I mean, it's like 7-8 years, right? It's unbelievable the challenges that you'll face. So challenges will, Parneet, all over, like just expect challenges and these things. So that is like a given. I can't think of anything other than, yeah, that is just like generally there's always been, but I think you as a person you have to be really creative. Like for me, I've had data collection. I have a brother, like he's a medical doctor in Copenhagen. I've had him help me with data collection early on when I was like doing my sleep paralysis work in 2011, 12 or 10 or something. I can't remember, but you got to be really creative with like who can help you and how, and if you have to go on a plane sometimes for research purposes. So yeah, I think these are the main things. Again, like the ethical dilemma thing. I can't think of one thing, but other than, yeah, we've had projects, been, on hold for 7-8 years, 9 years, but that's just the nature of the game. And I guess if you have a lot of different projects that you do, then that can, then you can always, like, you have this project that's on hold, but then you're doing all these other things. So it's good to have a lot of things going on, so you don't sit and like wait 8 years, literally, like for a project to be completed. So.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Alessandra, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Alessandra, and I am a Peruvian undergraduate student. I study currently chemistry and would like to follow the path on neuroscience. Basically, my question is related to sleep paralysis. I also read that in the chat box, but I have had some episodes under stress conditions and also under calm conditions. And I would like to understand also what is the tiger behind this, because I have experience with lipidomics, metabolomics, and also searching for neurotransmitters in the brain. And as a curious person, I would like to know if there is a specific part and where I can focus to understand more this, I don't know if to call a disease or episodes. And I would like to know, what can you tell me about it? Thank you.
No, that's okay. Before you go though, Alexandra, I just want to make sure I understand the question, because the line was breaking up a bit, the connection. So you want to know like what's sleep paralysis, what's going on in the brain and why we have it? Is that kind of what was it?
Yeah, specifically if it's related to a specific molecule or if we.
Oh, yeah. It's a great question. Yeah. So Alexandra, you can stay on the line. Let me tell you. So then if there's anything that's not unclear, you can let me know right away. So basically, yes. So in the brain stem, in the lower part of the brain, you have certain chemicals. You have brain structures, the pons and the medulla, and these have sort of release of glycine and GABA, inhibitory neurotransmitters that's responsible for the complete paralysis or of your muscles, right? So you have this skeletal muscles are paralyzed, okay? So you can't move and you can't speak. And this occurs during the REM stage, right? During the REM stage of sleep. So we have that paralysis. So that is, and then the reason why your sensory system becomes active, and that's the thing about sleep paralysis, is you are in REM, you have this REM paralysis going on, right? But then you become active. Now, why that occurs is unclear. We don't know, like actually why you could, but it's not that surprising. I mean, there's a lot of glitches in the brain, right? There's a lot of things that can go awry, but for some reason your sensory system becomes active, and things, as we mentioned, anxiety and other things can pull you more towards that. So you have the coupling of these two systems. But to give you a little bit more details on that as well, is a lot of the stuff of REM sleep. So I mentioned serotonin, and serotonin producing neurons and noradrenaline producing neurons, as you mentioned, the neurotransmitters. These neurons stop firing altogether during the REM stage of sleep. But when we wake up, you potentially have a surge of serotonin flooding the brain. Okay, so it goes all over the brain and potentially activating a receptor on the brain called the serotonin 2A receptor, which can explain why you have all these ghostly hallucinations potentially. This is a hypothesis that I've proposed, but it explains why the world is really bizarre and strange. Serotonin 2A receptor is the one that's activated when you take psilocybin, psychedelic drugs and things like that. Is that clear? So REM sleep, no serotonin. You wake up, lots of serotonin, potentially flooding the serotonin 2A receptor, potentially like, being in a psychedelic-like state, and then you're seeing all these ghosts. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you. And I have another question. Maybe it's not related, but just in case, do you think sleep paralysis is related to difficulties upon awaking?
Sleep paralysis, difficulties upon waking, is it really, what do you mean exactly? Like, do you mean that you have, can you explain more?
Yeah, well, I can tell you personally, I don't struggle with going to sleep early or late night, but I struggle with waking up early. It's very hard for me to do that. So I don't know if it's related with sleep paralysis or something.
Waking up early? No, not per se, but you could say that if you have a sleep-wake cycle that's a bit wacky, or it's like you basically are not good at keeping your sleep-wake cycle in check for genetic reasons, or maybe because of anxiety drugs and all those things, but in just a lot of people, their sleep-wake cycle is kind of, it goes awry for these people, this cycle. And so that can lead to sleep paralysis. In fact, the genetics of sleep paralysis may be linked to the particular gene that regulates this sleep-wake cycle. And that's why you see in people with narcolepsy, which is a sleep disorder that's very debilitating, right? So these people will fall asleep during the middle of the day, or during a talk, they will just fall asleep. So it's very scary. But in that disorder, the sleep-wake cycle is completely messed up, obviously, and they have sleep paralysis as one of their key symptoms. So yes, perhaps actually it's a good question, Alexandra, because yes, maybe if your sleep-wake cycle is messed up, you wake up early, or then you may be more likely to have sleep paralysis. So yeah, glad you asked that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will read more about these genes. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Amazing. Awesome questions, everyone. Thank you. And I believe we're almost about time. A couple more minutes to go. So as we wrap up, Dr. Jalal, is there anything that we haven't chatted about that you would like to mention to students? Any advice, parting words?
No, other than I can see you guys, I can see a lot of your names, a lot of folks from India and a lot of folks from other countries and things. And I'd say, I being culturally underrepresented, I grew up in Copenhagen as of Kurdish origin, Muslim, growing up in a certain country, different religion, different culture, different hair color, everything different. And it motivated me to become a scientist. Wanted to do good, to help my community, help people, and be a good example to others, to help people that are struggling, help people that are underrepresented in that way, and people struggling, so I'd say to you guys, you have an extra burden to work really hard to help the folks of your communities, whether it be here or be your families back home, your people in your home countries, inspire them. So you have to work very hard to be a shining example. And yeah, you have an extra reason to work really hard if you have experienced challenges or if you are somehow considered underrepresented in some way. So that should never be a reason for you to feel excluded from society, but to feel included more and try to work harder and inspire others, regardless, of course, of any race or whatever gender. That doesn't matter. But point is that that you shouldn't feel excluded. And I sometimes did perhaps feel excluded growing up. Just to be honest, I did sometimes feel that, and it was, that's normal when you are different, but you shouldn't feel that. It should just be a motivation to work really hard. But yeah, no, I was lucky. I grew up in Denmark. It's a very welcoming and very nice country, and I really loved living there and growing up there. So I was lucky. But yeah, work very hard and help others and bring another person up. And I think that would be my message to you.
Really appreciate that, drawing power from our roots.
Of course.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jalal. Once again, we really, really appreciate your time. This is a really fascinating kind of winding conversation, but very relevant and essential conversation, from research to academia to mentorship and beyond. Everyone, if we could join together in a virtual round of applause. I know it's a bit odd on Zoom, but really appreciate your time. And we'll say goodbye for now.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.
All right. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.